So I'm going to start off. My name is Charles Ford, and I'm Sarah's father and Diane's husband. And my grandchildren are in the first two rows. For the most part, they're all mine. And then I have the really unenviable task to speak humbly and confessionally to start out. So Diane and I grew up in Baltimore. I was on the east side of the tracks. She was on the west side, the nicer side. And we grew up in the 60s and 70s, a turbulent time. And I want to set the stage for our thinking and how it's changed. The culture at the time was one where you went to high school. We both went to public high schools. And dating was just an accepted part of life. I was a little more studious and not very athletic, and so I don't think I appealed to women very much in high school. And I know with girls, it's hard to believe. And so I didn't date much, but I sure wanted to. Diane, on the other hand, was very attractive and athletic and very self-confident, so I'm sure she probably sinned more than I did, or at least she had more opportunities. So in all that, what we learned through high school was that you formed an attachment with someone, you dated for a while, then you would discover quite naturally that they were sinners. And so then you would break up and heartache ensued, and then you would rinse and repeat, hoping that the next person wasn't a sinner either. Eventually, you would fall into a relationship where the sinner that you married wasn't as bad as the sinners you dated, and so you married them. And Diane and I met each other at one point in our life and fell in love, and we married. And then I'd probably say the first 3 or 4 years of our marriage, we grew up with the same cultural expectations. We'd raise our family, and they would do fairly similarly to us. They'd go to school, they'd go to high school, they'd go to college. Eventually, they'd find someone and marry them, and all would be well. Early in our married life, our thinking suddenly got challenged by the concept of homeschooling. And I can remember the first discussion we had on that, which was, had to do really more with education. Diane is smarter than I am, and in many ways, almost every way. But one thing I noticed almost immediately is she couldn't spell. And she'd ask me how to spell a word, and I'd tell her, and I'd say, well, just sound it out, honey. And she couldn't. And I thought, oh, gosh. So we finally realized, I went to Catholic school, and they taught us phonics, and she went to public school, and they taught them the look and say method, and we wanted our kids to learn phonics. Well, as our homeschooling journey grew, and it grew fairly exponentially, we suddenly realized it wasn't about education, it was about a life and bringing our children up properly in the love and nurture of the Lord. And I don't want to fill my talk with biblical quotes. This is a quote from the Bible, but it's also a prayer that all of us know, and I'm going to just modify it a little bit. And lead them not into temptation, but deliver them from evil. And I'm thinking about that as a parent in terms of my children. And we got exposed to the idea that maybe dating wasn't the best approach to finding a husband for our daughters. We didn't have sons, but you can apply it. That maybe there is a better way. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to my wife now, who with gentle nudging, guidance, and probably more prayer than I'll ever know, helped me to understand how we might best not lead our children into temptation. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, babe.
So good afternoon. I am Diane Ford, married, happily married to Charles for 43 years, 43.
She says it, I believe it.
So you got a thumbnail sketch. So Charles and I both grew up in wonderful homes, but unbelieving homes. And so we just flowed with the culture. And then we got married in 1980. And from the get-go, we knew we wanted to do something different. We just didn't know what it was. Oh, let me grab my notes. We just didn't know what it was. And so Sarah was born in 1982, and we're just moving along and learning every day. You know, you do learn on your firstborn. And so we're going along with just regular life, and she's growing up, and Charles told you that we both dated, but knew that we wanted to do something different. So in 1991 was our very, very first exposure to this idea of something possibly different. And we attended a seminar by a man named Greg Harris, and it was called the Advanced Homeschooling Workshop. So it did mainly focus on homeschooling issues, but there was this one session. I'm not even going to tell you the name of it because you'll just shudder. But it was, for the first time, someone was speaking about something different. Just the possibility of something different, that we didn't have to follow the way that the world had set. And the scripture really did have something to say about how we get to the altar. And so that was very exciting. So that was 1991. Sarah was only 9 at the time, so we weren't really stressed at that point. We lived overseas for 2 years. We got out of the Army in that time. And I say we because I was known as the dependent wife. Happily, mind you, but that was the phrase in the Army. So we moved to Boone in 1995, and at that point, Sarah was 13, and it really was time to get serious about whatever this other thing was. And so I started reading everything I could get my hands on, and talking to people, because there was this feel out there. There was this sense, and there were a lot of people like us that were trying something new educationally, were excited about it, and we wanted to make other changes in our life. So I started reading in 1995, and the other thing that we did in 95, Sarah was 13, which meant our second daughter was 10, and our third daughter was 8-ish. It was time to bring them in. And at least begin discussing the topic. And so we did that, and of course the only thing we could really tell them was, well, we don't know exactly what we're going to do, but we're going to do something different, and you are not going to date. At 13, that didn't really have a huge impact on Sarah. It was not really a part of her cultural world, so it didn't mean much. But I make that point to say that for parents, you cannot sit a 16-year-old down all of a sudden, if this has not been a part of the family conversation, and go, oh, by the way, Susie, you're not going to go to the prom. You're late. You're really, really late. And so this discussion has to start. In fact, if we had known, we would have started it at 9. We didn't know to do that, but we did start the conversation at 13, and it's very, very important. And it's also important to make sure that they know you have their very best interests at heart. You are on their team, and you really only want good for them. You are not trying to squash their fun. So that was a side note, sorry. So I started doing this reading and researching and talking, and it was a really exciting time. So the first name we came across was a man named Jonathan Linville out of California, and he taught a lot of Christian seminars, and he had a teaching called Shame-Faced Romance. Very, very challenging, and he was also addressing what was going on in our culture. I think Lucas and Sarah are probably going to mention Doug Wilson, Doug and Nancy Wilson. We have read a lot of their material on child raising, but they have a wonderful book called Her Hand in Marriage. And so Charles and I were reading all of this and talking about it, and you know, we always have a plan. So we were trying to come up with what the plan was. And then Okay. All right, sorry. A team talk. So then we came across a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye by actually Joshua Harris, who is the son of Greg Harris, who first introduced us to this concept. And so I don't know, anybody familiar with this book? Okay. Josh has taken a bad turn, but it does not negate the truth that he spoke in this book. So I devoured this book, and then that meant he devoured it after, we just did it together. And this clarified what this thing looked like, something different. So after we read it and talked about it, then we handed it to our firstborn. And she read it, and I would say devoured it. And so after she finished it, she came to us, and I will never, ever forget what she said. She said, I know y'all have been talking about this for a long time. She said, but I never really got it until now.
I didn't realize the benefit of doing this in that I'm hearing some of this story also for the first time, as you guys are, which is encouraging and interesting. I didn't, as I was preparing for today, I didn't remember any bombshell moment where my parents came to me and said, you're not going to be dating. And, I fell to my knees screaming at the heavens, no! I didn't, it just slowly infused itself, I guess, in my consciousness. But it was when Dad and Mom gave me the book by Josh Harris, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, that I saw the value in the truths that he talked about in that book. And I got excited about it and took the conviction on as my own, not just Dad and Mom's, here's what we're doing for our family, but where I became personally excited about. About scriptural truths that govern romance. I embraced the idea that marriage is the only relationship where passion could be Christ-honoring. But then I realized that my believing that required some decisions and certain actions. So in addition to a commitment I had already made for physical purity, I began striving toward this concept of emotional purity and began working to not think romantically about any young man or indulge a crush or anything along that line. And then as I'm working on this in my own individual life, we begin to meet other families who have tried, as my mom said, just something different, have tried something different as a method of getting their sons and daughters married. And I heard for the first time, the words of courtship and betrothal, which up to that point, I think I just sort of thought of those as something that was in a John Wayne movie like The Quiet Man, or that I'd read about in the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, something from, way back then. But it was still fascinating and encouraging to hear about and meet other families who were pursuing this other getting into marriage methods. And it led to many conversations with Dad and Mom and my other 2 sisters about what this process might look like in our home. But one thing I knew very well by this time was that my heart was not a submissive follower to my intellectual reasoning that romance should wait for marriage. And I figured if it was hard at that point, that if a guy ever came along and expressed interest in me and that we actually started courting, or something that you do in a buggy, something, I don't know, my heart wasn't going to sit down quietly and wait while I did some calm evaluation, of this man who actually might like me enough to want to marry me. And yet, at all times in your life, that's one of the moments when you need that calm, deliberate evaluation. So I decided to do a little bit of jumping the gun and do some of that evaluation before any man came around. So this led to what got nicknamed in the Ford family as make or breaks. And I began a list of issues that were of primary importance to me, that were so important that one single issue would be a deal breaker, where it wouldn't matter how similar in every other area I was with this man, wouldn't matter how handsome he was. If we didn't share similar convictions on this one particular matter, despite all the other similarities, that would be enough to say, no, I'm sorry. So I began this list and then handed it over to my dad. And we talked about it. And I did add to that list through the years a little bit here and there, as I learned and studied and observed. But I said to Dad, I don't want to know about a guy if he's interested unless he passes this list. Because if he doesn't, then it just makes it so much easier. If I know him or we know his family and it's going to be a no answer, things can just kind of smooth over and he'll have the assurance that I'll be living in total ignorance, and never even know that something was started. But the other thing that giving Dad the make or break list did was it provided me with great freedom. I didn't have to worry about that next step in life and was just able to pour myself into living the best single life that I could for the Lord, to have the freedom and the time and the energy to continue learning, to pursue some home businesses, to serve our community and families we knew, and to be hospitable with my family that I was living in at the time. And it was just, it was a wonderful, freedom-filled time that doesn't equate to easy. Every season has its particular temptations and struggles, and there were definitely moments that were very hard and difficult, as in any time of life. But I was always secure in my identity and what I was doing in that moment, and I knew that we had a plan for the future if it was needed, and I was very content.
If you were here earlier, you heard the Emmanuel Quartet, and I noticed that we are 4 people, and that's where the analogy stops. I am Lucas Smith, and if you were here earlier, a child of God. And I'm lucky enough to be your husband. And I'm cursed with this thing, and I get in front of people, I start crying. But many may be shocked to learn that modern dating, as we know it, is a relatively young phenomenon in Western culture. Pathways for arriving at marriage are varied and usually involved some sort of parental assistance and in the process. Usually as a vetting agent. And the corresponding divorce rate tracks directly with the emergence of dating. Whereas nobody on this stage lived during first wave feminism, we all came of age on the cusps of second wave feminism, roughly the 60s to late 80s, which was marked by the alleged dream of sexual liberation. Mom and Dad came of age at the beginning of that movement, and Sarah and I came of age towards the end of the second wave and beginning of the third. All that to say that the general attitude of our two generations were marked by little, if any, parental oversight, a sense of autonomy and individualism, and lastly was marked by cultural influences that were attempting to obfuscate the differences between genders. I grew up in a home where, and as I listened to their testimony, I'm a hybrid of how they grew up and how she grew up. So, and Mom shared a little bit about how if you have this conversation with your kids at 16, you're kind of behind the ball. I would agree with that. But if you're not 9 years old or 13 years old, or you have kids that are that age, I'm the one guy, out of 100 that could actually hear a message like this and be changed. So pay attention and come to the light. It can happen. I hope it does happen for you if you've never given these ideas any thought before. I grew up in a home where gender and gender roles were more or less still distinct. I was raised in the church and considered myself to be a very committed Christian. Apart from a commitment to follow Christ, one of the most serious commitments in my life occurred just as I was entering puberty, namely the early to mid-90s True Love Waits campaign. Does anybody remember that at all? I see a couple of people. Which was out of Nashville, Tennessee. I made the vow and proudly wore the t-shirt. As I entered high school, I kept this vow, but with great difficulty, and endured temptation that required what seemed superhuman powers of resistance. It was endurable because I believed I was leaving something special for my wife. It was during this period of time when I began to date that I asked my father for advice, and he gave me the advice of, it's okay to go necking, just don't go too far. I thought, this doesn't seem like physical purity, and I don't trust myself to know where too far leads to. As I began to date girls in high school and college, I was under conviction. If the principle of physical purity was true and good, I could not truly help but feel guilty for the emotional attachments I had to the women that I dated. The whole while I would argue that I took the prospect of marriage seriously. For me, dating was not just a recreational thing. It's telos, its end was, in fact, marriage. So I was definitely committed to that idea. In college, the Christians I respected were committed to physical purity and embraced a courtship model. This was where my commitments lied during those years. However, this made that emotional, spiritual component that much more awkward. But nobody around me, not my parents, not my church, not my friends, and no one on campus, organizations, were talking about emotional purity, or a sense of purity that extended holistically to the whole man, heart, soul, and body. When serious-minded Christians that were dating broke up under this model, it was devastating, usually to the woman, and was in truth a rending. It felt more of a divorce of parts from a previous bonding that had in fact occurred. Of course, some of this perspective is retrospective, and it eluded me at the time. Anyway, I was in the midst of such a breakup when I met the Fords. The breakup was fresh, and Dr. Ford and his family had heard about it. After Sunday school, Dr. Ford singled me out and approached me with a stout rebuke. He claimed my actions were reckless and that I had defrauded the girl I had recently broken up with. I'm not sure that I would have listened to a word he said after that. He confronted me, were it not for Mrs. Ford walking up, tugging on her husband's arm, and suggesting an invitation to their house for a more profitable opportunity to speak than the situation that was developing. In the entire course of my life, apart from God's salvific grace in Christ, I count this open rebuke on Mr. Ford's part, together with soft, inviting wisdom of his better half, to be the greatest act of grace in my life. It didn't start off that way. I went home fuming, mad, having my intentions questioned, my manhood challenged. The words dishonorable and defraud rang in my ears. I recall pacing around the house like a lion and being spitting mad, preparing mental arguments of rebuttal. I found solace in this verse. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it's to him it's folly. I conveniently thought Dr. Ford to be foolish, having judged and answered before knowing me or anything about my circumstance. And I armed myself for combat and went over to their house for dinner. And some of that conversation is a blur, but I recall when it was just the two of us sitting on the porch, I moved to bring out this verse. But the moment I did, I felt a powerful conviction run over me. I felt I was the fool. And that I was getting ready to answer without hearing a word that Dr. Ford had to say. The Holy Spirit softened my heart, and I began to listen. That evening, Charles laid out a better way of arriving at marriage and handed me a book to read called, I think that book was Her Hand in Marriage that night. I recall thinking that dating was really practicing for divorce. It did not take me long to evaluate the principles and condemn my own views and embrace what the Fords were saying. In part, it felt like a homecoming. Deep down, I knew that dating and courtship, though may be done with a mind to physical purity, allowed for bonding, exclusivity, and commitment prior to covenant. And if true love really did wait, then it should wait for everything. At this time, my parents divorced, and it was a very confusing time for me and my brother. I knew it had to be different with me, and so I began to seek out godly marriages like the Fords and others. My relationship with them grew just in time to say goodbye as I was off for seminary. During seminary, I thought a lot about marriage and how to get there. As I attended class, I kept correspondence with the Fords, and I remember taking a marriage and family class where we were discussing the marital covenant. As an assignment, we had to write vows that reflected our understanding of that covenant. And as I wrote them and thought seriously of what kind of commitment this was, I remember thinking to myself that there were very few women in my life that I would even consider entering into this kind of relationship with. In fact, Sarah Ford was the only person I would even consider being married to at the time. It was rather simple for me. I knew everything that I needed to know about her from a distance and from the context of Christian fraternity. I didn't need to try the shoe on or give the car a test drive. Love was a decision, and her character was easy enough to evaluate from a distance from where I sat. I just needed time to seek the counsel of others and make sure this was something that I was ready for. But at the time, Sarah and I, really the whole Ford family and I had become very fond of each other, and we were corresponding and occasionally meeting to catch up. And you'll hear a little bit more from Dad here in a second. But he perceived maybe our friendship was getting too close, and wanted to sit down and talk with me about that. And it was in the context of this discussion that I thought it was appropriate for me to tell him what I was at least considering at that time, and that I was considering his daughter's hand in marriage. But during that period of time, I sought the counsel of others around me that I knew would give me good advice on the timing of that and all of this. And then at some point in time, I knew that I needed to have a conversation with Charles about her hand.
You know, I noticed that in the context of Lucas's talk, I was Dr. Ford, Mr. Ford, Charles, and Dad. So I guess I've been everything to him. Oh gosh, that was a beautiful testimony from him. I'm a man who likes principles, and I like to let principles guide my thinking. And I just want to give a principle of 6 words. Men know men, and women know women. And so in the context of everything we're discussing, that is good guidance. It might sound simplistic, but what it means is that when Sarah brought her make or breaks to me, she was saying, Dad, I know that you will be able to be more objective in evaluating a suitor than I will, because I'll be more likely to give my heart, and I'd probably shut my eyes before marriage to the type of man that you select for me to be married to. And also, I think it's easy for somebody like Diane to look at somebody like Lucas and see all the good qualities, but maybe not measure the qualities that make a man a man. And by the same token, if you have sons, it's really, really important to have their mother weigh in on a future daughter-in-law. The only advice I'd give to the mothers is, don't be too hard on them. I mean, they're women too. So all that to set up, at some point in seminary, it finally came to Lucas that, you know, one of my requirements never was that everything had to be checked. Sarah didn't mention this, but she had about 150 make or breaks. I mean,
Slight exaggeration.
okay, it was 144. But it was a slight exaggeration. I mean, it was 2 pages. And I'm looking at it, page and a half. And I looked at it and I thought, no man can satisfy her. I mean, I said, look, I know she loves me, but I couldn't meet these requirements. And so, you know, we did have to negotiate some of them because they just, if you can't meet every single one of these requirements, but I will say this, in fairness, Lucas came really close to most of those requirements. So, you know, I've always said, he's me on steroids. I mean, whatever I am, he's that much more. And so that's always good. So really the question that I had to determine, is he the right person for Sarah? And unbeknownst to Sarah, maybe unbeknownst to you, I'm not sure, but we actually got with his mom and we had dinner with her one night, and just any concerns we might have just about him. And we weren't that close with his father, and so any influences his father could have that might have been negative, we wanted to make sure that those kind of things weren't going to be operative after marriage. And we were pretty satisfied after that. So he and I sat down for, believe it or not, his was the shortest period of time. I think it took maybe about 5-6 hours.
Are you going to tell them about the cold room and the leather gloves and slapping them?
Well, I was going to, all right, there was that. But then once he passed that test, then it was about 6 hours of, you know, the hot light. And
Right.
tell me, Mr. Smith, where were you? No, it was about 6 hours, you think, we talked?
Yeah, or less, yeah.
Yeah, more or less. And that was our first interview. And then, you know, I got most of my major concerns answered during that. And then Diane and I talked, and then after that, we were reasonably certain that Lucas would be the right person to marry Sarah. I had maybe one other thing on my mind, and I'll just say this. What was it?
Immunization.
No, I wasn't going to say that. So I had one more thing on my mind. He answered it correctly. It was really peripheral to marriage and everything, but it was how I wanted to, something about the grandkids that I wanted. And he agreed to it. So we were actually at my brother's house in Raleigh, and Lucas was in seminary in Raleigh, and we were there for a conference that weekend. And I said, I think it would be fine to propose to Sarah, even this weekend, if you're ready to. And I said, we have the conference and we'll be at the pastor's house the next day, and that might be a good opportunity. After he answered this last question, then we were actually in church, and I said, Lucas, kneel down. And so he's pretty obedient back then. He knelt down, and I gave him my blessing. I said, and I actually laid my hands on him, and I blessed him, and I said, you can ask Sarah today. And I said, but whatever you do, because like I said, me on steroids. I said, whatever you do, please go slow. She doesn't know anything about this. Take your time, bring her into it.
So this is my favorite part of the whole story, is the proposal. So this had been 1.5 years that the Ford family had known and been friends with Lucas. 1 year he had been gone at seminary, and early on in our getting to know him and becoming friends, many conversations and, laughter and time together. And my first attraction to Lucas was actually intellectual. I began to realize, wow, this is, I think, maybe the only guy I've ever met who's like lining up with those make or breaks. If he ever was interested, I might actually be able to say yes. And when my mind made that realization very quickly after that, my heart wanted to just follow right along. But I didn't know if he was interested, and was committed to that idea of emotional purity and pursuing a focused single life and saving any passion of heart, mind, or body for marriage. And so I had a year of some sanctification and continually just setting thoughts of Lucas aside. And sometimes I thought, maybe he's interested, and sometimes I thought, I don't think he is. So we were down in Raleigh at this conference and had gone to the pastor's farm. And I want you to picture in your minds an ancient spreading oak tree, clipped green lawn, sun, breeze, okay? And if you've got that in your mind, you're with me in my favorite proposal scene from Jane Austen's Emma. That's where we are, okay? And Mr. Knightley says, I rode all night, I rode through the rain. I'd ride through worse if I could just hear you say I have a chance. And Emma's eyes close in blissful happiness, and she smiles, and Mr. Knightley clasps her hand and says, oh, dearest Emma. Well, we had the spreading tree in the grass and the sun, and I think that's about where the similarities end. So Dad had lured me outside to say, look at this goat fence here. And Lucas walked up, and I thought, oh, he wants to talk to Dad. And I was actually turning away to leave when Lucas said, Dr. Ford, can I walk around the pond with your daughter? Well, in my frozen shock, I wasn't actually forming any coherent sentences in my mind, but I still knew in that moment everything that must have already happened. Like in an instant, I knew he must have met the list, and he had Mom and Dad's blessing. And like without even having to process it, I knew where we were at in this story already. And that was definitely confirmed with my dad's answer of, yes, you may. So the next part, it was like the movies, because we started walking, and I heard Lucas's voice somewhere in the distance. But I wasn't grasping any words. He was just talking, and we were walking. So about after 2 minutes of this, a word or two began to filter through to me, and I began to think, wait, this isn't just some general declaration of interest. I think he's getting ready to ask me. And then just as my mental scramblings got to that point, Lucas stopped walking, so I had to stop too and look at him, which was like horrors. And then he got down on one knee and he said, will you marry me?
He's down on one knee, babe.
Yeah. They were watching from a window of the farmhouse. Dad saying, I told him to go slow. So my mouth opened, and my mind is saying, yes. And I couldn't say anything. I did close my eyes, like Emma, but all I could see was this cliff in front of me. And that one word was going to be a step off the cliff, not necessarily a bad step, but just it was going to change everything. And I couldn't say that one word. And he's still down on one knee. So he finally stood up, and I sort of miserably said, "Can we keep walking?" And so then he graciously asked me, would I like to hear what he and Dad had discussed over the past months, when I'd been wondering, is he interested? I'm not sure. So we spent the next 2.5 hours circling these two little ponds again and again, while he gave me all the details that you just heard in brief brushstrokes. So then for all of his pains, at the end of that 2 hours conversation, he got as an answer, "Well, I don't think you're going to get a no." That's as far as I got at the end of the day. But I told him I wanted to send him a few more questions that I wanted to know the answers to before I made that final commitment to this sacred, never-ending, lasting marriage. And I knew I had my parents' blessing, but I wanted to talk to them too. But later that day, when I actually had a quiet moment to think and process what had happened, I realized that this man met every single one of my issue of primary importance, make or breaks, every single one. There was nothing, no question left that was going to be big enough to override our shared convictions about God and His Word and children and family and all those other foundational issues. There would probably be things that we would discover we thought differently on, and there have been. Hold one second, right in the middle of that momentous moment. There they are, the other part of my notes, sorry. There have been those issues that we've discovered that we thought differently on. But I realized I had found the man that I was willing to work through those other issues with. So I realized then that the only thing holding me back at this point was good old-fashioned fear. I was afraid of what I didn't know. I was fearful of trusting finally and materially in a particular man. But then I realized that marriage and life is not about trusting in a person. I was being called to trust God, that He would preserve and flourish Lucas and I if we stepped into this marriage together and as we strove to serve Him together. And so then, rewarded for his patience that even exceeded Mr. Knightley's, Lucas finally got his yes, and it has been astounding to both of us in the last 18 years how powerful our union has been and is continuing to become. I don't want you to get the wrong idea of what I mean by this marital intimacy. We don't wear twinning sweaters. We generally don't enjoy the same kind of book or movies. I think actually Lucas's idea of purgatory is to watch a Jane Austen movie. Whereas mine is to sit stone still for 4 hours in the woods, in the cold, excited about the opportunity of maybe seeing a deer walk by. But despite those kind of differences, the foundation that we built with our shared convictions and passions has supported our becoming one in a very powerful way that still causes us to occasionally look at each other and marvel and say, I don't know any other husband and wife that are as alike as we are. And I wouldn't change anything about it.
So I realized my folly. I should have just led when I came to the podium the last time with, I'm the only guy who made her make or break list. And then if you know anything about her, you're like, oh, he's a cool guy, you know? So, so I want to wrap this up here and just talk with you guys about 18 years later. You know, I know we haven't talked a lot about some of the principles here. It was more of a testimony in nature, but what is my perspective after 18 years of marriage, 10 kids later, with kids entering into a marriageable age, you know, on the front end of that. And I would say the principles haven't changed, you know. It's still true that one should be, at least it's the same for Sarah and I. It's still true that we should be physically and emotionally committed to one person. Okay. I think the number one reason marriage bonds are dissolved in this culture are because of infidelity. And rarely is infidelity initially just physical. Though men and women are motivated differently, adultery almost always begins with the creation of emotional bonds leading to sinful physical union. This observation should instruct us and stand as evidence that we are more than physical beings and that a holistic approach to marriage is required. The disciplines and commitments to a biblical mind, heart, and body, biblical anthropology, prior to marriage not only allows one to arrive at marriage safely, but they serve the covenant of marriage thereafter. Okay? In other words, the principles we are advocating are the biblical principles of monogamy, right? Which should be practiced, we're suggesting, prior to and after one is wed. With that, we're gonna kind of end this part of it. I want to say, do you have a copy of it? My wife likes to say this is a book that she wrote for her children, but she published for you. So the title is "Must Christians Kiss Dating Goodbye?"